The moment I signed the final document, I looked up through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my attorney's office and watched the city of Nashville spread out 30 floors below me, glittering and indifferent and absolutely gorgeous. My hand was steady. My signature was clean. $38 million had just been wired into an account that belonged entirely, exclusively, and irrevocably to me. My phone had been buzzing continuously for 4 hours. I turned it face down on the mahogany desk and asked my attorney if she wanted coffee. I need to tell you how I got to that office. Because 2 years before that afternoon, I was sitting on the curb outside the house I had spent 3 years helping to pay for, with a single duffel bag between my feet and my husband's mother standing in the doorway making sure I actually left. My name is Claire. I was 27 years old when my marriage ended, and I want to be precise about the way it ended, because the details matter. My husband did not ask me to leave. He let his mother do it. He stood in the hallway behind her with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and he did not say a single word while she told me that I had always been a burden, that their son deserved better, and that the life I had built with him was never really mine to begin with. She was more right about that last part than she knew, and it would take me 18 months to prove it. I met my husband at a design conference in Atlanta when I was 23. He was charming and ambitious, and he laughed at everything I said like my words were the most interesting sounds he had ever heard. I was a freelance graphic designer with a small client list and a very large imagination, and he was a mid-level marketing coordinator who talked constantly about wanting to do something bigger. We got married quickly. His family was wealthy in the quiet, old-money Southern way, not flashy, but deeply connected, the kind of people who knew which doors to knock on and had been knocking on them for 3 generations. I moved into his family's orbit the way you step into a cold swimming pool. Gradually, and then all at once. His mother ran the household the way a general runs a campaign. She had opinions about everything I cooked, everything I wore, every client I took on, every hour I spent working instead of being available for family dinners. His father was quieter but more calculating. He asked questions about my business, with the specific focused interest of a man who was taking notes. His younger sister was the one who smiled at me the most. I thought she liked me. I was wrong about that too. My real work, the thing that would eventually change everything, started in the 2nd year of our marriage. I had been developing a proprietary design system. It sounds dry when I describe it that way, so let me be more specific. I had spent 4 years, starting before I even met my husband, building a modular visual branding framework that could be licensed to small and mid-sized businesses. It was essentially a technology-assisted design toolkit, and I had been quietly coding the back-end infrastructure with a software developer I had hired with my own savings. I kept most of the details to myself, not because I was hiding anything, because I had learned early in life that ideas have a way of disappearing when you share them too soon with the wrong people. I should have trusted that instinct more completely. My husband knew the general shape of what I was building. He knew it was valuable. What he did not know, or what I believed he did not know, was exactly how close I was to finalizing the intellectual property registration. I was 30 days away from filing when his mother called her family meeting. I remember that evening with a clarity that still feels cinematic. We were in their formal dining room, the one with the oil painting of his grandfather above the fireplace and the crystal chandelier that his mother had inherited from her own mother. My husband sat at the head of the table. His parents flanked him. His sister sat across from me and studied her water glass. There were documents on the table. A lawyer I had never met was seated in the corner. My mother-in-law spoke first. She said that after a great deal of reflection, the family had concluded that my husband and I were not compatible. She said this the way you might describe an unsuccessful product launch, measured, businesslike, without particular cruelty. She said arrangements had been made. She slid a document toward me. It was a separation agreement that my husband had apparently signed 3 days earlier. I looked at my husband. He looked at the painting above the fireplace. The agreement had terms. I would vacate the house within 48 hours. I would receive a one-time payment of $12,000 described as a gesture of goodwill. I would make no claims against any joint property. And there was one more clause, buried at the bottom of the 3rd page, written in language so careful it almost disguised what it actually said. It was a transfer of development rights for any intellectual property created during the marriage using shared household resources. I understood then. I understood completely. My husband had told his family about my framework. His father had figured out what it was worth, and they had built a legal trap around me before I even saw the cage. I stood up from that table without signing a single page. My mother-in-law started to say something and I held up one hand. I told her, very quietly, that I would be in touch through my own attorney. She laughed at that. She said I could not afford an attorney. She was not entirely wrong about that either, but she did not know what I was about to do next. I went upstairs. I packed one duffel bag. I took my laptop, my external hard drive, every notebook I had filled with development notes, and a small framed photograph of my grandmother that I kept on the nightstand. I walked back through the formal dining room where they were all still sitting, and I did not look at any of them. I walked out the front door. My mother-in-law came to the doorway to make sure I kept walking. I sat on the curb for 11 minutes. Then I called my friend Destiny, who was the most practical person I had ever known and who had disliked my husband from the very first time she met him. She came and got me in 35 minutes flat. That night I slept on her couch. The next morning I woke up at 5:30 and started making calls. Here is what my husband's family did not know about me. They saw a young woman with a small freelance business and a modest client list. They saw someone who had been absorbed into their household and their routines and their rhythms. They saw someone dependent. What they did not see, because I had been careful and because my grandmother had always told me to keep your most important things close to your chest, was that I had documentation. Extensive, time-stamped, server-backed documentation, proving that my design framework had been developed entirely from my premarital savings, my premarital client work, and my independently contracted software developer, who had been paid from a separate account that my husband's name had never appeared on. The clause in that separation agreement was designed to steal something my husband's family believed they could take. They were wrong. And I had 30 days' worth of evidence to prove exactly why. The attorney I found specialized in intellectual property disputes and had a particular interest in cases involving marital asset fraud. When I laid out my documentation in her office that first morning, she was quiet for a long time. Then she told me we had a case. A very strong one. I filed for divorce. I also filed the IP registration the same day. Using a priority filing designation, my attorney had flagged that locked in my ownership rights from the original creation date. The legal machinery started moving. My husband's family hired 3 attorneys. Mine was better. What followed was 7 months of the most exhausting, most clarifying, most difficult experience of my professional life. I worked through it. I signed new freelance clients from Destiny's guest room. I finished the final development phase of my framework. I kept every receipt, every email, every time-stamped file. I did not post about any of it on social media. I did not respond when my mother-in-law sent messages through mutual acquaintances describing me as unstable and dishonest. I did not engage when my sister-in-law left a review on my freelance profile suggesting I was difficult to work with. I documented those things too and handed them to my attorney. My father-in-law called me once, directly, 6 weeks into the proceedings. He used a tone he had probably used his entire career to make people feel small and grateful for his attention at the same time. He told me I was making a mistake by fighting this. He told me the family could make things very difficult for me professionally in Nashville. He said he was offering me a chance to settle quietly and move on with my life. I let him finish. Then I told him the call was being recorded and that anything he said could be used as evidence of intimidation in our ongoing litigation. The call ended very quickly after that. The deposition was where everything shifted visibly. My attorney had subpoenaed internal emails from the family's business accounts. What those emails showed was something I had suspected but not confirmed. My sister-in-law had been preparing a business plan using the framework's core architecture. She had been preparing it for months, starting before the family meeting, before the separation agreement, before any of it. She had taken detailed notes from a conversation she had with my husband about my work. The emails showed the plan being refined, and refined. They showed my father-in-law reviewing it. They showed my mother-in-law sending a message saying the timeline needed to move faster. The judge, reviewing the case, described the conduct as deliberate and systematic. I was awarded full and uncontested ownership of my intellectual property. I was also awarded damages, and there was a concurrent fraud investigation opened by the State Attorney General's office based on the evidence my attorney had turned over. But none of that is where the $38 million came from. That came from something I had been building quietly the entire time. Because while the legal process moved forward, I had not stopped developing my framework. I had actually accelerated it. Working from Destiny's guest room, then from a small studio apartment I rented when my finances stabilized, I had pushed the product further than I had ever imagined I could. I brought in 2 additional developers. I began beta testing with a group of 40 small business owners. The results were better than I had projected. Significantly better. I presented the framework at a regional tech entrepreneurship conference 9 months after I left that house on the curb. I had not planned to present. I was attending as press access for a small design publication that had taken me on as a contributor, but one of the scheduled presenters dropped out the morning of the second day, and the organizer was desperate. I had my laptop. I had my full presentation deck. I said yes. The presentation ran 22 minutes. During those 22 minutes, a venture partner at a firm I had admired for 3 years took out his phone and sent an email to 2 of his colleagues telling them to fly to Nashville. They flew to Nashville. The acquisition negotiation took 4 months. There were several interested parties by the end. We ran a structured process and selected the offer that gave me the cleanest exit terms and the most favorable ongoing royalty structure. When my attorney called me to tell me the final wire had cleared, I was sitting in her office on purpose. I wanted to be somewhere formal when it happened. I wanted the weight of the room to match the weight of the moment. $38 million. Completely, legally, documented mine. I turned my phone face down, asked my attorney if she wanted coffee, and let the number settle in my chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. I checked my phone 2 hours later, in the elevator on the way down to the lobby. There were 112 notifications. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails, emails, and 3 messages sent through my business website's contact form. The missed calls were from my ex-husband, his mother, his father, his sister. 3 numbers I did not recognize that almost certainly belonged to various family friends who had been dispatched as messengers. The contact form messages were artfully worded. One of them suggested that perhaps we had gotten off on the wrong foot. Another suggested that now that I had achieved success, perhaps it was time to consider what family really means. I did not respond to any of them. What happened to the people who had sat in that dining room was not something I engineered. The fraud investigation had its own momentum. My father-in-law's business relationships began to dissolve once the court documents became part of the public record, and in a city like Nashville, where everyone who matters knows everyone else who matters, public court documents move fast. 3 of his long-standing professional partners quietly ended their agreements with his firm. The firm began to lose revenue in ways that compounded. By the time the Attorney General's investigation concluded, the financial penalties were significant enough to require the sale of several assets, including the house where I had sat on the curb with my duffel bag. The house sold at auction for less than its appraised value. My mother-in-law was photographed at the auction by a local real estate journalist documenting the sale. She was wearing the same fur-trimmed coat she had been wearing the night she stood in the doorway making sure I left. My ex-husband's sister lost her position at the marketing firm where she worked when her employer, doing routine background research, came across the deposition transcripts in which her role in the IP theft scheme was detailed at length. She had been up for a promotion. She did not receive it. She did not keep the job either. My ex-husband took the outcome of the divorce proceedings harder than any of them, I think, because he had genuinely convinced himself that he was entitled to what I had built. He had told himself a story in which my work was a shared thing, a product of the life we had made together, and the legal outcome stripped that story down to its framework and showed him exactly how hollow it was. The last I heard, he had moved to a smaller city, was working in a mid-level role at a regional advertising firm, and had stopped talking about wanting to do something bigger. I did not feel what I expected to feel about any of it. I had imagined, during the worst months on Destiny's couch, that the moment justice arrived I would feel enormous, expansive. Instead, I felt quiet, clean, like a room that had been thoroughly aired out after a long winter. I moved into a house of my own 6 weeks after the acquisition closed. Not large, not impressive by the standards of the world I had briefly inhabited as a married woman. It had a garden in the back, and a room I converted into a proper studio, and light that came through the east-facing windows in the morning in a way that made the whole space feel possible. I also did something I had been planning since the second month of sleeping on Destiny's couch, in the early hours when I could not sleep and would lie there making lists instead of staring at the ceiling. I set up the Groundwork Fund. It was a grant program specifically for women entrepreneurs in the early stages of building intellectual property-based businesses. Women who had great ideas and careful documentation and no access to the kind of legal protection that should have been available to them all along. The first cycle awarded grants to 11 recipients across 6 states. The application process required each woman to submit her development timeline, her ownership documentation, and a brief description of the challenge she was trying to solve. Reading those applications was one of the most important things I have ever done. I recognized myself in all of them. Not the details, the texture, the combination of ambition and fear, and the specific loneliness of building something in a world that keeps telling you to wait for permission. I did not need the family that threw me out. I want to be clear about that, because I think it is the most important thing I learned, and I want to say it precisely. I do not mean that their actions did not hurt me, because they did. I do not mean the process was easy, because it was not. What I mean is that needing people and being dependent on them are two different things, and I had confused them for years. I had believed that if someone was present in my life in a structural way, a husband, a mother-in-law, a family unit, that presence meant something about my own stability. It does not. Your stability belongs to you. It lives in the decisions you make when no one is watching, in the documentation you keep, in the calls you place at 5:30 in the morning because the alternative is giving up. When people ask me what I would tell a younger version of myself, I do not say anything dramatic. I say, keep your receipts. I mean that literally, keep your financial records, your contracts, your time-stamped files, your written agreements, but I also mean it in the larger sense. Keep the evidence of your own worth, not because you will need it to prove something to someone else. Because on the days when the people around you are telling you that you are nothing and have nothing, you need to be able to look at something concrete and remember that they are wrong. The night I moved into my house, I sat in the garden after dark with a glass of sweet tea and listened to the neighborhood settling around me. No one was telling me to be quieter or smaller or more available. No one was standing in any doorway making sure I left. The garden was full of weeds that I was already planning to clear. The east windows needed new curtains. There was work to do, and all of it was mine. I thought about the curb, the 11 minutes, the duffel bag. I thought about how enormous that moment had felt and how small it looks from where I am standing now. Being discarded is not an ending. I know that sounds like something you embroider on a pillow, but I mean it functionally. When someone removes you from their life because they have decided you are no longer useful to them, they are doing you the significant favor of clarifying exactly where you stood. That clarity is painful. It is also extraordinarily useful. It tells you which room you were never actually welcome in, and it frees you to stop spending your energy trying to earn your place there. The family that sat in that dining room with their documents and their lawyer had decided, before I ever walked through the door, what my role was. They had a category for me, and they put me in it. And when I started to become something their category could not contain, they tried to take what they wanted and remove the rest. They failed at the taking. They succeeded at the removing. And the removing, it turned out, was the best thing they could have done for me. If you have ever been pushed out of a space by the people who were supposed to be your family, I want you to hear this. Your value was not diminished by their decision. Your worth is not something they had the authority to assign or revoke. The door they closed was not the only door, and the life on the other side of it is yours to build entirely on your own terms. Have you ever had someone try to take credit for something you created? Or use a relationship to claim what you built? Drop your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And if this story resonated with you, subscribe to Recovery Stories, because this community is built for exactly the moments when you need to remember that recovery is not just possible, it is the beginning of everything worth having. You are not what they decided to throw away. You are what was left standing after they tried.